Good morning and welcome to OT Investigates. In today's episode, we're going to be looking at the politics of Middle-earth. I have managed to corral some poor schmuck to spend the next 20 minutes or so with me. Joining me today is Onod.
Hello.
He is here to provide his signature enthusiasm and political political commentary, which we have to cut out of all the episodes for fear of some severe backlash. Basically, in today's episode, where did you find this essay? Can you remember where you found this essay?
On a weird Google spiral. I actually don't know exactly
Okay,
where. I can't remember.
okay. But today we're going to be sort of just going through, not our reaction to, it's not that kind of video, but we're going to be just talking about our thoughts on this essay here, which I'm going to flash up on screen for you. It is Political Institutions in J.R.R. Tolkien's Middle-earth, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying About Democracy by Dominic J. Nardi Jr. Full link and stuff for that is in the description. Essentially, what this essay was looking to do is obviously the world of Tolkien's world was quite fleshed out, but the political side of things was not sort of super fleshed out, and a lot of times it's sort of implicit rather than explicitly gone through. There are a couple of examples, like the mayor is elected in. Oh, hang on, is he called the mayor? What? Oh no, the Master of Lake Town is an elected official, and there are a few elected officials in the Shire and things like that, but there aren't sort of many explicit examples of elected governments and things like that. So we're just going to go through some of the points that we've picked out from the essay and how we feel about them. This may turn into a sort of mini series. It may be nothing at all. This, you may never hear this. It may just be complete shit. So we'll see how we go. So to start off with, we're going to talk about this diagram here. This is the command feedback diagram. And essentially, the author of this essay has put 6 different factions from the Lord of the Rings universe on there. They've got Mordor, Isengard, Gondor, Rohan, Lake Town, and the Shire. And essentially what they've looked to do is explain how maybe differences in geography or differences in sort of the nature of the people inhabiting those lands has caused different kinds of governing styles to appear. So Mordor, we all know about Mordor. It's got the majority of the, I guess, civilians, are we going to call them? I'm going to call them civilians. Or people being governed are orcs.
Subjects, perhaps.
Subjects is maybe a better way of putting it. Mordor doesn't do brilliantly for things like natural resources, like things like water are very sparse. The land isn't great for growing things, so they are very reliant on sort of the leadership providing and organising things for them. We'll talk about maybe the escaping it later, as it were. There's also quite a rigidly defined class structure. You have sort of orcs down here, and then you have your more elite soldiers, maybe your captains, your commanders, things like that. And then you have sort of the next layer up, which would be people like Ringwraiths, people who support the government. And then obviously at the top, you've got like the Mouth of Sauron, and then Sauron themselves ruling from the top.
Yeah. And Mordor is essentially a classic absolute monarchy. So Tolkien obviously hated allegory, so he avoided obvious kind of real world comparisons, but obviously no work can be complete without them. But Mordor, I would say, is very, very similar to like Tsarist Russia, whereby the monarch is completely absolute. And as the essay points out, in Mordor, there is no way really for you to change class. And of course, in Tsarist Russia, the serfs would have been tied to the land all the way up really until the very beginning of the 21st century. They were still observing that. So that's the kind of system where Mordor politically fits in then. Absolute monarchy. There is no real way for the ordinary sort of soldiers in Mordor to question anything. It is just a top-down structure.
Yeah. And even it mentioned in the essay, like your sort of maybe slightly more senior people like Shagrat and Gorbag clearly aren't happy. and like they feel the need to sort of keep their views, quite suppressed, and yet they're not able to express themselves. So even for people who are maybe above the absolute lowest tier, they have no ability to express themselves.
Yeah, and we see this in Russia as well. So, for example, you get the Decembrist revolution, whereby essentially commanders in the army felt like they had no way of venting any form of opinion, so
Mm.
they attempted a military rebellion, which was unsuccessful.
Successful.
So obviously we don't see that in Mordor, and obviously
Mm.
there is the element to which obviously Sauron is far more powerful than any absolute monarch in the real world could be,
Mm.
and so that would slightly alter things, but that's very much kind of the mold which Mordor is set in.
Mm. And then moving sort of down a rung slightly, looking at Isengard, it's laid out similarly, but with sort of fewer, maybe less layers of sophistication. There's less, obviously, of a support structure for the absolute leader. In this case, is Saruman. He has an advisor in Grima, but beyond that, there's nobody really obviously there supporting him and giving him advice. And all they really have are their military, the military commanders and the basic soldiers. So again, there's a couple of tiers there, maybe commanders and basic soldiers, but not a huge amount of sort of support going on. And it's clear again that you do have this absolute power. Maybe Saruman doesn't quite wield the same absolute power that Sauron does, but it's still quite a similar setup there.
Isengard's an interesting one, isn't it? Because Saruman isn't very well established at,
Mm.
at the time of the War of the Ring. Obviously, Isengard meant to represent kind of the negatives of industrialization. So you could almost view it as a kind of early capitalist. Saruman is the kind of industrial leader who his workers are not getting any real benefits out of the system, but
Yeah.
they also have no other choice in the matter, kind of thing.
It's a bit like
And
Victorian workhouses or something, isn't it? It's very bleak.
yeah, so essentially the Uruk-hai need to unionize, is what we're saying.
Okay.
Need to get on with it.
Then the next tier down are sort of the ones Gondor and Rohan, and they're arguably the two most similar. I think what the essay highlights is that maybe Gondor is slightly more formal, and
Yeah.
Rohan is a bit more, obviously, as it's geographically also perhaps a bit more spread out, and has less dense population. There isn't perhaps the need for the layer of hierarchy that appears within Gondor.
Yeah, and Gondor, I feel feels very similar to the kind of medieval system in England. So
Mm.
it's very formal and organized. It isn't quite to the extent of Mordor in the sense that there is ability for some social maneuvering, which the essay points out. We do get examples of people being promoted on merit, and of
Hmm.
course within a medieval English society that is possible as well, but that it's very, very structured. And even with the fiefdoms, where you have given over the ability for subjects to, lords to rule over specific areas, it's still very centralized. Whilst
Mm.
Rohan's very, very different because, and again, this is in the essay highlights, Theoden has to call his army,
Yeah.
and his army don't all turn up. He
Mm.
is much more reliant upon that aristocratic class.
Yeah.
And really, Rohan, I think the obvious comparison would be Anglo Saxons. And of
Yeah.
course, that would be the first one that springs to mind because of the way that they're depicted in a lot of,
Mm.
and obviously it's heavily influenced by Anglo Saxon mythology and that sort of thing. But I think actually, Rohan, it would probably be more apt as they don't have a system of kind of electing the king like the Witan did in Anglo-Saxon England. Far more like actually medieval France, a king who essentially can have less power than some of his nobles, and Theoden
Mm.
in reality is very reliant on his nobles. And we don't
Yeah.
see what would happen if they, like in historical France, rejected what he wanted to do, but
Mm.
that's kind of the feeling you get. He has to rely on them, and they hold the real power.
Yeah. It's really interesting. Like the essay highlights, I mean, it's quite a specific case, but something that maybe sums up quite well is the difference between the oaths that Merry and Pippin swear.
Hmm.
Like Pippin's is very scripted, it's quite formal, and like there is a prepared response from Denethor, whereas Merry's is much more ad hoc and done in sort of a less formal way. And again, it feels like even though arguably Theoden has more legitimacy than Denethor, like there is Denethor has this more sort of aristocratic almost air than Theoden does, and perhaps Theoden actually is, yeah, maybe not less powerful perhaps than Denethor, but like there's less of a formal power structure in Rohan.
It's almost as if there isn't that kind of written constitution, perhaps. Not saying that
Yeah,
Gondor has one, but
yeah,
Gondor's formalities are clearly perceived as being, in some way, this is what
mm,
must be done. Whilst Rohan's feel a little bit more like it is based on cultural and societal norms.
mm. And then moving down another tier to the sort of two more fringe cases at the other end, Lake Town and the Shire. Um, Lake Town is effectively run by sort of almost mob consensus, as it says, or mob rule, as it says here, that like this government survives on maintaining the sort of support of the people by whatever way is possible. The master actually doesn't seem to have a huge amount of sort of centralized power. And if the sort of mob, as it were, or yeah, a general populace turned against him, there's very little he could really do about it.
Yeah, and I think the obvious comparison for Lake Town is actually Venice, which, again, Tolkien really
Yes,
avoids allegory. So this is I think more coincidental than deliberate,
yeah,
perhaps. But obviously, the Doge of Venice, great name, Doge of Venice,
yeah,
um,
ahead of his own
elect,
time.
elected for life. But obviously, Venice, a very mercantile commercial state, and the elections are held by the aristocrats, the most powerful families, who of course would have a massive, you know, interest in the commercial activities of Venice and their policy. He
Mm,
obviously would essentially very much be under their control, if you want to think of it that way. They
yeah.
would have quite a high sway over realistically how much power he has.
Mm. Yeah, and like it is. I think I can't remember if it's in the books it's said explicitly or not, but like I think he's almost elected on the basis of him, making money and like causing the town to prosper essentially. And as long as he's able to do that, he's able to maintain
Yeah,
his power.
and his decision making is essentially populism. Just
Yeah,
if the people want
yeah,
it, he gives
yeah,
it to them,
yeah,
and he is very much just balancing precarity on top of that kind of power
mm,
structure.
yeah. Finally, the Shire, which we can go into a bit more detail actually, because the essay fleshes out a bit more for the Shire in a second. But
And I think this is by far the most interesting one.
yeah, because it's really a you possibly have a political historical example for it, but like this notion of virtually no formal government, and there are people who are elected, but they're kind of it's not strictly like a nominal position, but like it serves, there is little formal structure, and like it's not actually super clear how these people help everything run, and they serve quite minor roles. Like the mayor's duty, it says here, is to organize banquets, and
Yeah,
do the postal service and make sure cows don't escape. Like there is not this idea of organizing a military force, controlling things like taxation. Like none of this seems to be mentioned specifically.
no, it is. It's a fantastically decentralized form of government in the Shire,
Yeah.
whereby essentially the only form of government that exists is either ceremonial. So,
Mm.
thinking of like how much ceremony we have in England, which is essentially, pointless. Um, that's the kind of function that these officials have, or it's incredibly minor things like organizing the
Yeah.
postage system, which is something
Mm.
that Tolkien says that the mayor is responsible for. And the essay gets into some really interesting kind of like discussion of kind of
Yeah.
like how difficult it would be to properly administer the Shire
Yeah.
based on the fact that its inhabitants would be able to hide their assets because they live
Yeah.
underground. So
Yeah.
how would you be able to adequately tax them in a feudal system?
Mm.
And also this idea of kind of the nature of hobbits being that they don't really conform to the traditional human ideas. Like
Yeah.
they don't defend themselves because they don't perceive the need to.
Yeah.
And obviously, they don't realize that there are people out there who are defending their borders.
Mm,
But it's very much this kind of case of they have a few people who officially keep the boundaries of the Shire,
yeah.
but it's not this kind of big centralized system. Very very difficult to find historical examples of this, to be honest. I have one example. It's not quite as good as the others. It's really the only thing that I could think of, and
Mm,
people watching this may know more than me in this particular area. But the one example I could think of which might be comparable would be a group known as the Levelers, who appeared around the time of the English Civil War, and they
right.
essentially were trying to start what might be perceived as a socialist kind of society
Mm,
um, within the kind of republic, as we might think of it, the Commonwealth that is set up after the king is
mm.
executed. And there's a specific subgroup of levelers known as diggers, and
Right.
their ideas are essentially they believe that they're, or at least it is complicated because obviously it's not necessarily the same concept that we would have today. Because, for example,
Hmm.
they still didn't have things such as they wouldn't believe in the equal rights of men and women, for example. So obviously everything that the diggers were promoting kind of almost took that for granted. But they were trying to promote ideas of economic equality, essentially, and that land shouldn't necessarily be it shouldn't be possible that a very wealthy individual could just take a load of land and say this is mine. And they were kind of partly because obviously the king had been removed, so the hereditary right had been removed. They were kind of saying common land should be for common use. And this is something which I think you do see a similarity to in the Shire, in that essentially the hobbits are given the Shire because Arnor has become incredibly depopulated by men, and so
Mm,
they say, have this land because no one else is using it. And in return, we'll have a few archers. And so they do that. And obviously, then the state around them falls away and the hobbits are just left. And then,
mm,
obviously, the diggers in the English Civil War, obviously, the situation in England was quite, you know, unstable at the time. So for a period, they were actually able to basically just set up these communes, and they would just be able to farm this common land. Eventually, they were all kind of turfed out. They were almost too ahead of their time. A lot of them end up either basically having to conform or going to America, which is
mm.
perhaps there where you can see why there may be groups over there, especially also the religious groups that are forced to America, which would eventually rebel against the British Empire. But it's not a perfect fit because I
No.
wouldn't really say that hobbits are socialist at all. If anything,
No.
they're more libertarian.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
um, but when you're trying to look for examples in obviously like a medieval, which is the closest thing I think that we can have to a fantasy situation, like there are these very very niche examples of these groups which you can kind of perhaps take some inspiration from.
Mm. I think the thing that's most interesting to me about the Shire is that there is no requirement for centralized government that perhaps
Hmm.
the other sort of not countries but the other factions require. Like because it seems to be like there's plenty of farmland. It seems like actually they're able to produce more than enough food for themselves.
Yeah.
There isn't much need for this centralized support, and as a result it never appears. And like that's, I think, maybe is quite a sort of idealist sort of point of view to have, that it's not required. But like
Yeah.
it's interesting because like it seems like a utopia in some ways, but then it's like I think the scouring of the Shire does show that even in this you know, virtually perfect society, it does come with downsides. And while those downsides don't necessarily come from within, like it does show that perhaps some of the reasons why you do have to make sacrifice of military force and things like that is because these external forces do exist. And it's literally Sharky and a bunch of like random goons show up and just take the whole place over. And
Yeah,
yeah,
and the essay kind of gets into this about why the Scarring's so interested, because it's not that the hobbits can't have a system, because essentially the Sharky's rogues come in, they take over, they essentially set up a kind of military dictatorship.
yeah,
That's essentially what it is. But it's also interesting because it also, when the hobbits return and they rouse the other hobbits into some form of action, we essentially see that the hobbits do default to basically having leaders,
yeah,
because as long
oh
as
yeah,
there are hobbits who are willing to actually get them together and to speak out. So we get, for example, that Pippin's dad had, fought off the ruffians and that Tookland was free. And it's also suggested that Buckland is in a similar situation because they're
mm,
protected by the river. And all it took then was for someone to step in. And it's
yeah,
almost, you could argue that at that point, there's this Frodo is basically unanimously elected mayor. Frodo is almost in a situation there where he could become the leader, but he chooses not to. And I think
mm,
this is the thing. It's not that the Shire has chosen to be in this situation. I think it's more just that the nature of hobbits, and also the nature of the fact that they don't really ever have an external threat, means that they just don't need it. So they don't have it. But it's not that they
mm,
couldn't have it. It's
mm,
that kind of like balance. And I think this is what's kind of interesting about what Tolkien creates without explicitly referring to the politics.
mm,
There's no external pressures, so there's never a need to properly organize a system. If you live in a
mm,
society where there is there's no turmoil between classes, and this is something that the essay gets into, like there is no class friction in the Shire. Sam can go from being the most working class hobbit to
a
mayor.
gardener, yeah,
And this is something that the essay points out. Like, there's complete social mobility. The most wealthy hobbits live in hobbit holes. The poorest hobbits live in hobbit holes, and it's the middle class who don't. So there's almost like not this. There's not this separation between how the hobbits view each other, and they're actually far more likely to get involved in kind of petty local politics, which don't
mm,
necessarily need an organized government to step in and sort out. There's nothing pressing enough. Like there is
mm,
no issue large enough that requires it. And I think that's why they end up in the situation they're in,
yeah,
rather than that they have chosen this situation.
mm, yeah. But I think definitely like I suspect we actually I'm feeling like we will come back to this again in a future episode. But like I think perhaps the Shire is most interesting because there is no strict real world comparison that maybe exists sort of more or less obviously that with some of the other factions. But I think well, like one final question I want to ask before we get to the end is like on the whole in Middle Earth, do you think there is like how much value do you think is assigned to those in power? Do you think like power is desirable for people in Middle Earth, or do you think some people do it more out of a feeling of duty than they do perhaps in the real world, where there is clearly sort of a large section of society who desires sort of political or career advancement?
Yeah, it's interesting, wasn't it? And like the article, when it kind of gets into a similar area, kind of ends up looking at Tolkien's individual politics, which we're not really going to get into, but obviously would inform the way that he wrote.
Mm.
If you're looking at the books, I think that there is this, and it's a bit of a trope, isn't it? The reluctant leader makes
Yeah,
the best leader. You know,
yeah.
Aragorn
Or
is the best king
mm,
because he had spent all of this time in the wilderness not seeking power, and he
mm,
only comes to power in the right moment when it is absolutely required, and the time is right, and
Hmm.
he's never tried to seize it. And you also get this kind of idea that Denethor corrupted potentially by power, if we want to view kind of Sauron the Palantir, or
Mm.
definitely corrupted out of fear, which drives him into perhaps being more of a solitary leader than he was as a younger man. But
Mm.
even the stewards, they cede power immediately to Aragorn. There is no political
Yeah.
turmoil. There's no attempt to keep power. And amongst evil, obviously, there is they're seeking to dominate, but it's not that you are seeking to overthrow Sauron because monarchy is evil, because by overthrowing him, you replace him with another monarchy.
Yeah.
So really, the view is then that you know Tolkien is basically saying that you can have very much this kind of like benign monarch, that
Mm.
you can have a leader who is so intrinsically morally good that power will not corrupt them. And
Mm.
obviously, this is something in the real world where that doesn't really happen.
Mm. So I think that the Master of Lake Town is the one that stands out for me here because he's the only one who seems to desire control and power over others for the sake of having it.
Mm.
I think like Sauron is using it as a means to an end, as a way to control the world. Saruman, it's less clear what his actual end goals are. It's clear he desires to maybe control people and stuff like that, or gain more knowledge or whatever. But perhaps it's not as clear with him. I think Theoden is portrayed perhaps doing it out of a sense of duty, and like it's clear that he's inherited this
Yeah,
position and he
it's
should do it.
it's ancestral custom as well, isn't it? Like he
Yeah,
has to
yeah,
live up to his ancestors. So
yeah,
by taking part in the Battle of Pelennor Fields, he views himself therefore as worthy of their memory. So that there's
yeah.
a very big aspect to that, isn't there?
Yeah. And then like the Shire, there is no desire for any kind of power as far as I can tell. Like um these elected officials don't
Yeah,
actually have that much control anyway. So even if you did desire to control others, there's no mechanism for you to do that, short of I guess starting a coup or something. Like
yeah,
I don't really know
and
how you
and
would.
and the only Hobbit who actually does do this, who's Lotho,
Mm,
he more does it out of a sense of financial gain and
yeah.
desire to kind of modernize and make the Shire more economically efficient. Like
Mm,
that's kind of why he wants to kind of take over. And actually, like the message is very clear, isn't it, that Lotho ends up kind of regretting his decision.
yes.
And
Yeah.
obviously, when he's finally killed, like that's the kind of ultimate demise of that. And the other
Mm,
hobbits almost kind of, there's so few that actually go along with it willingly out of a sense of believing that this is a correct decision. It's more just a sense of most hobbits either don't realize what's happening till it's too late, or don't care.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah. I mean, that's the vibe of the Shire, isn't it? It's they don't feel the need to worry about things and worry about who's in charge because it doesn't generally affect them. So
yeah,
why would you worry about it?
yeah.
Oh, what a world they must live in. Um, cool. Well, that was actually way more interesting than I thought it was going to be. Thank you, Onod, for hopping on and dropping all your vast political and historical knowledge on us.
No, no problem. I hope that people enjoy the slightly more serious tone that this ended up taking than our normal videos.
Yeah, we're definitely going to come back to this. I think next one we might look maybe specifically at Tolkien's politics and how it impacted Lord of the Rings because I feel like that's a natural follow up to this
Yeah.
one.
Let us
Yeah,
know if you're interested in more kind of lore discussion. I don't
yeah,
like obviously there's loads of channels out there who do like let's summarize characters in books, but if
yeah.
people want us to take Lord of the Rings way too seriously,
Seriously,
we're happy to do so.
we'll have to do that. But yeah, right. Well, thank you very much for listening. Drop us a like and a subscribe. It probably helps, although we don't earn any money, so who can say? And yeah, we'll see you in the next one. Thanks,
Bye
guys.
everyone.